Equally welcome is the end of this myth of the centrally planned society. That's gone too, and I hope that basically the lesson is learned. But Milton seems to think that we have to choose between either a centrally planned society or a society in which we have markets which are basically unregulated. And so the choice is really between all or nothing. I don't think that's the choice. I think what Milton is posing for us is a model which is as unrealistic as the centrally planned model. It's outdated, it won't work, it's extreme, and I think it's undemocratic. I think that we have choices in between. What Milton called the third way, a way that he said wouldn't work, has been shown to work around the world. And I think that Eastern Europe would be very ill-advised to take Milton's advice on this. The last time anybody took Milton's advice on economic policy was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan has put the U.S. economy into a situation where it can't pay its bills and it's facing mounting economic instability and difficulties.
Dr. Friedman, what about this midway path?
Well, first of all, I utterly reject what Sam says about the results of Ronald Reagan's changes. We've had a decade of extraordinary growth, increase in employment, in which inflation was brought down sharply. Ronald Reagan came into office at a period of very high inflation and so on. But this program is not about the Reagan administration. This program is about Eastern Europe. And I want to go to Eastern Europe. I believe Sam is completely wrong in saying that the model I propose is outdated. I believe that what he calls obsolete is something very different. You have had the third way. You've had it in the United States, you've had it in Sweden, you've had it in Britain, you've had it elsewhere. In every case, it's been built on the foundation of a long period of what I call the first way. The United States had 150 years of essentially a free private market before it launched on this period of the welfare state. Same thing was true in Britain. The same thing is true in Sweden. I believe he will find it very difficult to cite any example of a country which started from a very low level and immediately adopted that combination of policies.
You know, I mean, you talk about Sweden and you talk about the third way failing, and Milton says nobody's ever really gotten rich on the third way. They've only benefited from that. But let's talk about the United States. The period you describe included a very long period in which the United States was a highly protectionist country, in which our industrial base was developed from Alexander Hamilton on for some time, and then during the late 19th and early 20th century. To call that a free market solution would be against everything you've taught. Or, if one wants to go back into the 19th century, the huge subsidies of the railroads were, of course, an intervention in the market. Now, these are...
Look,
let me continue, Milton. In the case of England that you talk about, the same is true. The role of the British Navy and the role, for example, of the Parliament in actually establishing the private property, which is what you favor. This was done by a government intervention. And if we talk about the other cases, talk about Sweden, or let's talk about Korea. These are two countries which I think are justly admired for their economic performance. Both countries have income distributions far more equal than the United States. In Sweden, over half the GNP is taxed. Now, people in this country would say, well, it's obvious they've gone too far. But let's look at the test of the market. Sweden and Korea have been defeating the United States in world markets. Exports have grown 5% per year during the Reagan-Bush years. In Sweden, in the United States, they've grown 1% per year. In Korea, we know they've grown much better. If you want to go on to Norway, where much of the investing is done by the government, they've grown their exports even faster than Sweden. Meanwhile, we can't compete in world markets.
But
so
look,
the lesson of these countries is, if you look at the facts, Milton, a combination of government regulation and the market works. I agree with Gary. I think private property is extremely important because the incentives associated with owning the results of your work is essential. But private property does not mean that we have to let the market go unregulated. And all the evidence is that the countries that are beating us in the world markets today don't do it. They're not that dumb. Japan doesn't do it. Korea doesn't do it. Sweden doesn't do it.
Let's not throw straw men around. Obviously, I am not in favor of no government. Government has some very important roles to play. Those are very limited. You take the case of the United States during the 19th century and of Britain in the 19th century. At the time of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1899, total government spending in Britain was 10% of the national income. Throughout up until 1929 in the United States, except for periods of great war, total government spending in the United States was about 10% of national income. Now that's a very far cry from a government which spends over half the national income, as is true in Britain, and a little less than half in the United States. Similarly,
you are opposed to capital controls. You're opposed to telling people they can't move their money internationally. That's what Korea does. You're opposed to...
absolutely, and I think Korea makes a mistake by doing it.
Well, Korea has beaten us by exactly the policies that you're opposing.
And so has Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has beaten us by the policies I'm proposing.
Well,
so we have to, and besides beating us,
Milton,
I don't
interpret that there is no middle way. And if Korea is not a middle way and Sweden's not a middle way, then I'd like to know what you'd call it.
Korea is a lot closer to a market-oriented economy than any of the economies we've been talking about.
The government approves the heads of the banks in Korea.
It does.
They nationalized their steel industry and have one of the most efficient plants in the world at Pohang. I mean, you know, if you call that a private economy, I don't think Milton...
What fraction of resources in Korea goes through the government?
A tremendous fraction if you take account of the fact that the banks are centrally run and they control the credit allocations there, and they don't let people take their money out of the country.
I'd like to bring this discussion back to the United States for a moment. What about socialism in the United States? There has been one area where we have tried to redistribute wealth. We have done that through our welfare policies, through Social Security. Has that worked?
Some people have benefited, but taken as a whole, I think it's been a failure.
But the public housing area, the public housing that we saw in Eastern Europe and the problems that we have here in the United States, aren't there some lessons to be learned?
Oh, there's absolutely no reason why housing shouldn't be privately owned. That does not mean that the government has no role in housing. It seems to me housing is precisely something that ought to be a matter of private property. But we also know, from the experience of this country, that the market itself doesn't provide housing that the rest of the public thinks is adequate for the vast majority of poor people in this country. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be done by the government building the houses, but it certainly does mean that something has to be done, or we're going to have the kind of homeless crisis that we have in this country, and they're getting one in Eastern Europe too.
And what role has been played in the difficulty of getting housing? By government interventions, by rent control, by excessive building code regulations, many of which are designed to protect the interests of special groups.
Look, Milton,
those have played a very large role.
The homeless people are homeless because they're poor and they're out of work. They're not homeless because of rent control.
I beg your pardon. Not all of them aren't. Of course there are some like that, but the existence of rent control has certainly increased the number of homeless.
Let's talk about incentives, because I know that both of you like to talk about incentives a lot.
You do too.
Well, I think incentives are terribly important. And Milton says in the show, and I agree with him, that we have to choose between taking orders from the top down or incentives at the bottom. Now, Milton's idea of how do you get the incentives down at the bottom is essentially a view of an economy in which individuals, through their ownership of property, can own the results of their hard work and their innovation. It's a great idea. It doesn't exist anywhere, and it can't exist. The idea that, I mean, when I read your stuff, Milton, when I watch you on TV, I think, you know, Milton has this idea of, you know, Charlie Brown and Linus are going to have a lemonade stand, and Lucy's going to have another lemonade stand, and that's your idea of capitalism. But that's a myth. That's not what capitalism is. We don't have thousands and millions of little firms competing on a level playing field. We have giant industrial corporations that use their power to their own advantage and to the disadvantage of others. And that's what you have to be able to deal with if you want to be relevant to the modern world. That's what the countries that I talked about, Sweden, Korea, Norway, Japan, are very good at doing. Dealing with the problem of economic power so that the power of those institutions can be used by and large for public good. If you ignore them with this lemonade stand capitalism myth, you're simply giving those powerful centers of wealth and affluence free rein.
It's it's a strange thing that not a single one of the countries you've described has a standard of living as high as that of the United States with respect to the bulk of its population.
Yes, and the United States got its standard of living through precisely the policies that you've opposed, such as protecting our industrial base from Alexander Hamilton through the McKinley tariff, to subsidizing the railroads.
Tiny part of you, I'd be very happy to go back to 19th century U.S. policy. It was a tiny part. The government, sure, they did some things, and maybe
they
some
built
of these
canals
things,
and so on.
I agree. I had a colleague at Columbia who did a lot of work in that area. But it's a tiny part of the economy.